Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for Surviving the Holocaust. My name is Megan, and I am the Programs and Exhibits Supervisor at the Arlington Heights Memorial Library. And I am joined tonight by our Programs and Exhibits Manager, Jennifer, and of course, our presenter, Steen Metz. The way that we have tonight set up, you do not have the option to turn on your video or to unmute yourself. However, we highly encourage you to use the chat feature located at the bottom of the screen to chat us any questions or comments that you have. Steen will answer as many of these as time will allow at the end of the presentation. We do have automatic captions enabled, which you can turn on and off at the bottom of your screen. If you are on a mobile device like a tablet, you will need to turn these on and off from the Zoom app settings. Please note that this program is being recorded for sharing on our social media channels, and only the presenter will be recorded. In a few moments, we will be releasing an attendance poll to give us a better idea of how many we have joining us tonight. And immediately following tonight's program, you will be directed to a survey, and we greatly appreciate any and all feedback as it helps us with our program planning. And now I'm very excited and honored to introduce you to tonight's speaker, Steen Metz. Steen, thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it on over to you.
Thank you very much, Megan. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. And I welcome all our viewers. We were just talking about technology, how it has changed the last couple of years. We would not have been able to have a presentation like this, say, 2 or 3 years ago. And now everyone can sit in the comfort of their room and watch. I want to start off by saying that I feel very, very lucky being here tonight. I was in a camp with over 15,000 children. Less than 1,200 or less than 10% survived. I'll never forget at a school, I talked to a lot of students. A few years ago, a middle school student asked me, and I thought it was a very good question, do I feel guilty or lucky being alive? I first of all feel lucky. Today, it's more important than ever before that we never forget the Holocaust. Many people are starting to forget it. It's well over 75 years since it ended. There's an increase in denial of the Holocaust. I know I'm not totally objective, but I can never understand how anybody can deny that the Holocaust took place. There are books written, videos, films, Holocaust museums in major cities. But unfortunately, there are more and more people that are denying it. That's one of the reasons why I speak to as many students and as many institutions as possible. I think it's so important that we spread the word to as many people as possible, also considering there's increased vandalism of Jewish property. For that reason, I'm going to ask each of you tonight, be my ambassador, speak to at least 4 people, don't necessarily stop with 4, tell them you know that the Holocaust took place because you listened and saw an eyewitness. I would appreciate you doing that, and it will make a big difference. I feel education, education, education is the key. I wrote a book, and later on, I think Megan will tell you how it can become available. It's called A Danish Boy in Theresienstadt, Reflection of a Holocaust Survivor. It was self-published 10 years ago. It was updated about in November 2018, and I included some new chapters, including questions from students, from people at libraries and so on, and I included my answers. As Megan told you earlier, I look forward to taking your questions at the end of my talk. On the next page, I may add, there was only one reason why I wrote the book. I wanted to make sure that future generations would remember the Holocaust. This is a map of Denmark. And sometimes I have Danish people in the audience. It doesn't happen very often. But if by any chance we have any Danish people in the audience, later on, please send the chat to me, send a message to me. I was born and raised in the middle of the country in a town called Odense. You may call it Odense. Denmark was occupied for 5 long years. Hitler and the Nazis invaded Denmark on April the 9th, 1940. I was almost 5 years old. They invaded Denmark by land. You can see at the southern part of the map, Denmark borders to Germany. They invaded Denmark by air. I can still remember the low-flying planes over Denmark, and by sea, and we are certainly surrounded by water. This was a totally unexpected attack. We had been neutral during World War I, and expected the same in World War II, especially since we had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler, along with 20 other countries in Europe. We found out very early on you couldn't trust that evil man. It was a very short battle, a few hours. The Danish government, the King Christian X of Denmark, surrendered. I'm not going to take a position whether that was good or bad. I'll let history judge it. But I will say it probably saved thousands of lives. It's amazing to me when I look back at the first 3.5 years of the occupation. I would classify conditions to be relatively normal, certainly relatively normal, and with emphasis on the word relative, compared to other occupied countries. As an example, as a Jewish boy, I would not have been able to go to school in Poland. My father, an attorney, would not have been able to practice law. Can you imagine the human rights taken away from people just because they happen to be born Jewish? There were a number of reasons why conditions were relatively normal. I believe the major one was the fact that the Danish government, to a great extent as possible, tried to cooperate with the Germans that had invaded Denmark, at least for the first 3.5 years. We also produced some agricultural products that were used to export to Great Britain. That was stopped immediately, and Hitler ordered them shipped down to Germany. We also fed all the German troops in Denmark. So that played a major role in being relatively normal. Also, at that time, out of a total population of 4.5 million, excuse me, only 8,000 people were Jewish. Most of them located about 90-95% in the area around Copenhagen in the northeast corner, the capital of Denmark. This is one of my favorite pictures. King Christian X riding on his horse every morning to show support to the Danish people, especially the Jewish people. People are always amazed when they see this picture that there's nobody around him, no bodyguard. He's doing that all on his own. It's amazing that he was able to continue to rule. In most other countries, the royalty escaped, some of them to Great Britain, some of them as far away as Canada. You'll notice 2 German soldiers, Nazis, saluting the king. The king didn't want to have anything to do with them. He hated the Nazis, and I like the way he's ignoring the Germans. I mentioned earlier that the government also was able to govern. if you recognize this young fellow, I guess I haven't changed very much. But there's a much more important reason for sharing this slide with you. This picture was taken in the summer of 1943. When I look back, it's surprising that my family, consisting of my mother, father, and myself, we were able to go on vacation. The German troops were marching up and down the streets in Denmark. We had a good time away from home for about a week, and I continue to be amazed that that was possible. But things changed drastically in the fall of 1943. And Megan, if we can go back to the map, the slide of the map, that would be great. Thank you very much. What happened to change the conditions? Many young people, upperclassmen in high school, students, they were very, very unhappy that the Danish government had surrendered so easily. They started forming groups in just about every town you can see on the map. One of the most famous ones was the Churchill group in my hometown. And they started getting weapons from Sweden. You can see the creamy color to the east of Denmark. Sweden remained neutral throughout the World War II. And we also got weapons from Great Britain. And it was amazing how these young people, they were very, very courageous. It was a dangerous mission. I refer to them as Upstanders. They stood up for what they thought were right, as opposed to the many bystanders that were looking the other way. They were so successful in their major mission to prevent products being shipped down to Germany from factories in Denmark, not only food products, that the German commandant went to the Danish prime minister, told him he had to stop the saboteurs, he had to sentence them to death. There was no way the Danish prime minister would agree to do that. That became the beginning of what we call the final solution, the arrest of the Jewish people. Once again, it was different in Denmark. One of the leading German officers found out of the date of the arrest. We're now talking about late September, early October 1943. He leaked the word to the Danish administration. They had taken over from the Danish government. The Danish government resigned on August 29th. Word got around, especially in the area of Copenhagen. Again, this is where most of the Jewish people lived. As a result, 95% of the Danish Jews managed to escape to Sweden. It was wonderful that our neighbor, the Swedes, agreed to open their borders for the Jewish people. They were helped by many families, non-Jewish people. They were also upstanders. Many of them actually lost their lives. They would house the Jewish people, they would hide them. They would hide them in their homes, summer homes, cottages, so on, even in hospitals and churches. As a matter of fact, a cousin of mine was hiding on a loft in a church just north of Copenhagen. Unfortunately, living in the middle of the country, we had not been alerted. And that may sound strange to many of you, but as I tell the students, communication channels were so different in those days. We didn't have television. We certainly didn't have the smartphone. And we basically relied on newspapers, radio, and phones. And the Germans had cut off the phone lines. So one early morning, October the 2nd, 1943, I was 8 years old. two Gestapo officers pounded on our door. We lived on the third floor in an apartment. My parents were totally surprised. They had not expected it. And after the war, when my mother was asked, why didn't you try to escape? And she was basically saying, we didn't think it was serious because nothing had happened the first 3.5 years. We got about 30 or 40 minutes to get ready, packing suitcases. Later on, we were driven in the truck you can see in this slide on the left into a schoolyard in the middle of our town. You can barely see the assembly of Jewish people in the schoolyard. It's supposed to be 60 of us. We spent a couple of hours there, and later on we were transferred. Oh, this is, by the way, a very unique picture, artifacts. To my knowledge, that's the only picture that exists of the arrest of the Jewish people. Later on, we were transferred into this cattle car. Not this particular cattle car. I don't want to mislead anybody, but a cattle car very, very similar. Can you imagine spending over 80 hours in complete darkness? There were no lights, there were no windows. There was one door on the outside, in the middle, and it was locked from the outside. The uncertainty, we had no idea where we were going. They didn't provide any food. We got nothing to drink during those 80 plus hours. Fortunately, some of us had brought some food that we shared, sandwiches, snacks that we shared with other people. I was looking around. People, of course, looked very sad. They actually looked frightened. You can imagine the 8-year-old boy was very, very frightened. He couldn't quite understand what was going on. Why was I there? Why were my cousin or my neighbors not in the cattle car? The atmosphere was very, very tense. The smell was getting worse and worse. We spent, as I mentioned, 80 hours under absolutely awful conditions. I don't know if I mentioned about the smell, but it was getting very, very bad, worse and worse. We had no bathroom facilities. We had to use buckets in the corner. We made one break, got out, got some water to drink, back in the cattle car. And again, we had no idea where we were. We arrived in Theresienstadt. Theresienstadt is the Czech version of Theresienstadt, which Theresienstadt is the German version. And I'll use both versions as I talk about my life in Theresienstadt. Located in was then Czechoslovakia. Today it is the Czech Republic. The camp was about 550 miles away from Denmark, and it was about, I would say, 40 miles north of Prague. This is the train station where we arrived, with the Jewish people walking into the camp on the right. At that time, we didn't have a train station in Theresienstadt. We had to walk for about 1.5 miles. As soon as we arrived, we were ordered to empty our pockets. They took our valuables, cash, jewelry, whatever they could find, went through our suitcases, did the same, took some of our good clothes. My father later on told me that when we were arrested, the officers of the Gestapo had encouraged my father to bring money. We would have plenty of time to spend it. Sure enough. Next, divided into groups, men, women, children, and seniors. You were considered an adult if you were 16 years or older. This is an illustration of a loft. My mother spent over 18 months in this loft. Miraculously, she was able to persuade the German people that I could stay with her the entire time. This was very unusual, but I have met other survivors that stayed with their mothers. I think it was good for both of us. My father would stay in a similar barrack with very similar conditions, living in hot weather in the summer. At night, I would wake up, I would be scratching myself. I had never heard of lice and fleas. My mother explained it to me. People would die from typhus. There were many people dying in the camp from not having enough food to eat. Anybody 16 years or older had to perform slave labor. And the more I think about it, the more unfortunate it was that my father, an attorney, was ordered to work digging ditches, road work. It was cold. It was the beginning of the winter. My father was physically abused, as we were told by one of the younger men who worked in the same group. He wore a winter coat. One of the officers came over and literally took the coat off him. You don't work with an overcoat. Easy to say when they didn't provide any uniforms. He was also kicked, he was whipped. He lost, my mother told me, about half of his body weight. We didn't get very much food, and I'll cover that in a little while. He ended up in an infirmary. They had great doctors and nurses, inmates from many different countries. They tried to save my father, but they were not able to. He died of hunger at the young age of 40, having been married less than 10 years to my mother. Of course, the Germans were not going to issue a death certificate saying my father or anybody dying of hunger. They listed the reason as pneumonia. My mother was not physically abused, as far as I know, but she was certainly mentally abused a number of occasions. She worked in a factory, huge factory, had to clean the floor. They worked long hours, 10 to 12 hours a day, weekends, Jewish holidays, Christian holidays. At the end of one day, a German officer came in, looked at the floor in the factory, saw a bucket of water, dirty water. He walked over to the bucket, literally kicked the bucket, and the dirty water spread all over the floor. My poor mother had to redo the floor. When she got back to the barrack, she was very, very upset. What can you do? I cannot imagine how anybody can treat another human being in that way. I was 8 years old. I didn't have to work. My mother thought some volunteer work would be good. The time would pass faster. Not much you can do at that age. I became a messenger, a gopher, and I would bring messages and documents from one German or Nazi office to the other. Never touched, they never hurt me. As a matter of fact, they never spoke to me because I couldn't understand German and they couldn't understand Danish. But they looked very intimidating, and I tried to move from one office to the other as fast as possible. One day on my way back, I passed the kitchen. At the end of the kitchen, there were big sacks of raw potatoes. I looked around to make sure nobody was watching. And then I put a potato in each pocket, and my mother and I would share it. We would eat it raw. Yes, I was stealing. I shouldn't have done it. I still remember when we were liberated, my mother was still concerned that this would become a habit of mine. She actually thought I would become a kleptomaniac, but fortunately, this was not the case. So let me talk a little bit about food. It's not going to take long. At breakfast, we would get what they call coffee, boiled water with coffee substitute, about half a loaf of bread with a little margarine. The bread and margarine had to last the whole week. On the next slide, you'll see how we lined up for lunch. I call it a soup kitchen. It seemed to me that we got potato soup every single day of the week. In the beginning, I didn't eat it. My mother said, Steen, you're not going to make it if you don't eat the soup. That was, of course, all the incentive I needed. We would stay in line for about 35 or 40 minutes with our wooden spoon and bowl. In the beginning, we would try and get soup from the bottom, so at least there were some potato peels, potato skin in it. How they were ever able to call it potato soup, it was boiled water with some potato peel, I'll never understand. At dinner, we were standing in line again, got different kinds of soups. At least there was a variety. I remember a barley soup. Once a week, we would get a well-known German dish, a pasta dish, which was dumplings. How were we able to survive on those meager rations? Not only not very much food, but not very nutritious at all. 35,000 inmates, women, men, and children, died, just like my father, of hunger. We started getting packages in April. They came from Denmark. Christian friends sent us packages. It was, in the beginning, it was arranged by Red Cross. We also got packages from Sweden, from our Jewish friends and from our Jewish family. My entire family, except an uncle and his wife and mother and their son, managed to escape to Sweden. We started getting, as I mentioned, the packages in April. Can you imagine if they arrived a few weeks earlier, my father might have survived? We probably got more packages than any other nation. Any nation, they were entitled to packages. We had very little anti-Semitism in Denmark. We had great, great support from the people, probably more support than in any other country. And there were relatively few Jewish people in Denmark as compared to in Poland that had 3 million Jewish people in the beginning of the war. So one day, my mother received a package. It was very, very heavy, and she couldn't understand why it was so heavy. She opened it. Normally, we would get clothing, we would get vitamins, and we would get food. She started opening the package. No food, no vitamins, no clothing. At the bottom of the package, she found a couple of bricks. Those terrible, terrible guards had taken the good stuff and replaced it with bricks. How can anybody get satisfaction out of doing this to other people? I'm not saying that the guards got enough food to eat, but they certainly got more than we did. I want to give you another example of time, life in camp. I was a growing boy. I was 9 years old. My shoes didn't fit me anymore. No shoe stores, no department stores. My mother bartered with a Czech lady. The Czech lady got some food, I guess butter, salami, and cheese. My mother got some used shoes. I was able to wear them the rest of the time in camp. Many people ask me, what did I do apart from lining up for food, working a couple hours in the morning and the afternoon? I played with other children. I especially played with some Czech children. We became very, very friendly. And we started playing soccer. Of course, we didn't have a real soccer field. We had a gravel field. The mothers took some old clothing, tied it together, and were able to kick it around. found some goalposts. We had a great, great time. That was probably the only time during my 18 months in Theresen that I almost, with emphasis on almost, felt like a free person, forgetting for the moment that I was in prison. I was able to communicate with the Czech children. I learned the language phonetically. So one day the children don't show up, and I'm very concerned. What happened to them? My mother said, don't worry, I'm sure they were ill or they didn't feel like playing today. They'll be back another day. Later on, I found out that those poor children had been deported to extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau. 85,000 inmates from Theresen were deported to extermination camps. Few of them survived. Many of them ended up in gas chambers. I didn't know about this deportation until later on. I don't think my mother thought it was necessary for the 9-year-old boy to know about it, but she told me there were terrible scenes. The husbands didn't want to leave without their wives, vice versa. They tried to leave the children behind. It was just a terrible, terrible situation, as my mother told me about it. I went back to Theresen in year 2009. I wanted to do some research. I wanted to see the town as a free person. My mother was often asked, did you ever think about going back to Theresen? She said, no, absolutely not. Once is more than enough. But I'm glad I went. It looked much bigger than I remember it. I saw where I played soccer. I saw the barracks, and I saw this memorial. Exactly at that spot, the Nazis ordered children my age, boys and girls, to form a human chain from a crematorium out to the river, and you can barely see the river in the back. In the beginning, the dead bodies were buried. They ran out of room, so they built a crematorium, and the crematorium had urns, cardboard urns with name of the dead person as well as the number. So one by one of the cartons were passed on from one person to the other, and eventually 25,000 urns ended up in the river. Later on, I heard that a good friend, Danish friend of mine, 2 years older, before he passed it on to me, he wanted to make sure that the name and the number could not be seen. He turned it around so I wouldn't see what my father's urn. Very sensitive and amazing for a boy of 12 years. The next slide is very, very interesting. You may or may not have heard Theresen being described as a model city. Very, very deceiving. It was a model city on one day only, June 22nd, 1944. The Danish administration wanted to see what the conditions were for the Danish Jews. Initially, the Nazis denied entry. After several attempts, the Nazis said yes. They thought they could use it as propaganda. And quite frankly, they were quite good at propaganda. So the Nazis prepared Theresen, cleaned it up, planted gardens, lawns, set up benches, pavilion with musicals, painted the buildings. When I say this was all done by the inmates under the direction of the Nazis. Fake storefronts, there was food in the windows. The sinks didn't work. There was no plumbing. It was just for show. It was like one big play. Took a while for Theresen to look the way The Germans wanted it to look. They postponed the visit 3 times. Prior to the delegation arriving, they sent about 10,000 frail older people to extermination camps. The delegation, Red Cross people from Denmark, from Switzerland and Germany arrived on June 22nd, 1944. They spent about 46 hours in the camp, including lunch. Never saw what the camp really looked like. They even had the nerve, the Nazis, to transfer the Danes to better conditions. So we were fewer people. It looked like an apartment. It looked like living conditions were quite good. Eventually, they returned to their respective countries, never knowing, never finding out how the Danes or anybody else lived in a concentration camp. We had, of course, been told to be quiet, don't ask any questions. The delegation from Denmark, I remember, said, we bring greetings from the king. But anybody, the Germans said, anybody who would speak up or talk to the delegation would be sent in transport to an extermination camp. I want to move on with what I refer to as happier days. And on the next slide, you'll see the white buses, the Red Cross buses that came from Sweden. Sweden, again, was a neutral country. You see the Swedish flag on all the sides, the Red Cross logo. On April the 15th, a convoy of about 20-25 buses arrived. We've been told about it a few days earlier, but couldn't believe it until we actually saw the buses and we entered the buses. And it was a miracle that the Swedish and Danish drivers were able to drive through Germany. The war was going on, there was heavy bombardment, and a miracle that we were able to return up through Germany. I remember on several occasions we had to stop because of heavy bombardment. And I remember looking out the window afterwards, and I looked at some Nazi soldiers. They looked so young, teenagers. I guess most of the adults had fallen, lost their lives during the Holocaust. On the next slide, you'll see us arriving in Denmark. We've just crossed the border. What a welcome. Row upon row of people giving us flowers, giving us candy, chocolate, cigarettes to the adults, sandwiches. When I look at that picture, I'm always surprised that they were able to stand in line welcoming us back, and the war was still going on. We had no idea when we were in camp what was going on. Did not hear about other concentration camps. We heard about some rumors, had really no idea, hadn't heard, to my knowledge, about the Allies invading France. We were very self-centered. We were thinking of ourselves. We wanted to make sure that we made it another day. The uncertainty was great. Would we get enough food to eat? Would we be sent to extermination camps? Would we be ill? All kinds of bad things could happen to us. We were not able to stay in Denmark. We went on to Sweden. We were in quarantine for about 2 weeks. They wanted to make sure that we didn't bring any illnesses like typhus into the country. We reconnected with our family. And I want to emphasize, especially if you heard survivors talk before, we all have a different story. Most survivors from Poland, Germany, and Czechoslovakia lost their entire family. We lost one person, unfortunately, my father. The rest of the family, about 14 people, managed to escape to Sweden. It was wonderful to see them again. And we celebrated a couple of weeks later. This is a Danish flag, and it was flying everywhere in Denmark and also in Sweden, some places. On May the 5th, 1945, that was the official date the Germans had surrendered, and the Danes celebrated as never before. It was 5 very tough years. We were very thankful to General Eisenhower and the Allies for invading Germany. Can you imagine if the Germans had won the war? I certainly wouldn't be here today. I may add that it's also my birthday on May the 5th. And in 1945, I was 10 years old. And on that date, and on May the 5th in future years, I would always tell friends, family, whoever wanted to listen, not as much family because they knew about it, but I would tell them that actually Denmark is flying the flag today to celebrate my birthday. Some weeks later, my mother and I were able to return to Denmark. It was very difficult in the beginning. We were a nice family of 3 people. We lost my father. We lost our apartment. It had been rented out. The belongings had been stored by the legal company where my father worked. We had nowhere to stay. Fortunately, some friends put us up, got some clothes, got food. Little by little, we got back into everyday life. Eventually, my mother was able to get a small apartment. They were very difficult to get in Denmark at that time. I think the legal company where my father worked probably helped. I went back to school. No schooling allowed in any camps. I missed 3rd grade and most of 3rd grade and all of 4th grade. Yes, we got some private lessons in camp. I got some private lessons from a nice teacher when I returned to my hometown. And I think it was very important for me to be able to go back to my old schoolmates and jumping into 5th grade with my old mates, old friends. It helped in transitioning from my life in Theresienstadt to my life in Denmark. Later on, I graduated from high school, then from commercial college a couple of years later. Then living in a country about the size of Rhode Island, I wanted to see part of the world. I joined a Danish food company. I've always been fond of food, so it was very hard during the war, during the Holocaust, to go to bed hungry just about every night. I spent time in Denmark with special training, then they sent me to England, then I was in Canada, eventually United States, and I've been in the United States since 1962. I continued to work for food companies. Later on, I joined some American food companies like Sara Lee and Kraft. Maybe subconsciously, I wanted to make sure that I would always have enough food to eat by joining food companies. I retired in 1999. And when I think back, we spent 18 long months in camp. And it's now 22 years since I retired. Years, not months. When you get to my age, time flies, and it's flown very fast. As I said earlier, I'm very lucky to be here. And it's become a passion of mine to talk about my experiences, spread the word to as many people as I possibly can. And I'm lucky I kept record right from the first day. And I've spoken to over 94,000 people. And my goal is to reach 100,000 by the end of the year. So if we have anybody in the audience, parents, grandparents, or maybe even teachers, I'll be more than happy to come to your school via Zoom or something similar to talk about my life in Theresienstadt. I'll finish off on the next slide showing you my website. some of you may be interested in more information about me. I'll finish here. I could go on and on, but I think this is a good time to start with questions.
Steen, thank you so very much. You shared that so eloquently and so thoughtfully. And I think we all are feeling very humbled and grateful that you were here to do this with us. I do want to again invite everybody who's here this evening to go ahead and to share any questions that you have in chat. Since we are in webinar, I can share those to Steen with you. Steen, I'm curious to know, when did you first meet any other survivors, and what are your relationships like with other survivors?
I didn't meet any survivors in Denmark because there were no survivors or just one other Jewish family in my hometown. At that time, I didn't meet any survivors in Copenhagen. My family, most survivors, including my mother, really wanted to try and forget about it. As far as I'm concerned, you never forget it, but she wanted to concentrate on the future, so she didn't encourage it. I really met a number of survivors when I started being part of the Speakers Bureau at the Holocaust Museum in Skokie, and we were comparing notes of people that were in Theresienstadt. And while we have been in the same camp, we all have a different story because it all depends on the culture, where we came from, how old we were, and so on. And since then, I met a number of other survivors, and we have compared notes all the time. And we get together at the museum about once a year over brunch. Hopefully that answered your question.
Oh, that was an excellent answer. Okay, I'm going to start with a personal question, which has come in from one of our attendees this evening. And that is, has your faith changed as a result of your experience?
The faith changed while I was in camp, especially in the beginning. It was difficult to see where God was. Had God forgotten about us? Why had God forgotten about us? And that's a lot of other people, especially my family, cousins, and so on. There's another survivor who has written a book, and I read, he said, maybe God was on vacation. Then God came back again, helped us being liberated. So he hadn't forgotten completely about us, and we were liberated, as I mentioned, in April of 1945. And again, very, very lucky being liberated from 18 awful months. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for that answer. Another question. Well, actually, first I want to tell you that there is an attendee tonight, Jane, who said, you have spoken to my husband's high school classes at Homewood Flossmoor High School. And Jane is thankful to be able to hear you tonight. So thought you might want to know that Jane was here. And
which school was that?
That was in Homewood Flossmoor.
Oh, yes. I've been there a number of times, quite away from the Northwest, but I actually was down there talking to summer school one year. Thank you for bringing it up, Jane. I appreciate it.
You recall this so well. I mean, with the number of people that you've spoken to, you have such a great memory of how far you've reached. I know we've talked about which schools you have and haven't been to in the area and which you're going to next. I also wanted to let you know that Janice, who's here tonight, did share that she has a very good Danish friend who lives in Sarnia, Canada now. So she wanted to let you know that.
Okay. As a matter of fact, I know Sarnia because I lived in Canada for 2 years and married my wife in Canada in 1962. So thank you for mentioning that.
Oh, absolutely. And then a question, a historical question. Can you share, why did the Germans let the Danes go in April before the end of the war?
That's a very, very good question. I mean, they're all good questions. They wanted to set up kind of a model in Denmark. They wanted it to be different than in other countries. It was a very small country. There were very few Jewish people, and they got the Danish government to cooperate. That was one reason, because of the cooperation. Later on, the Danish government has been criticized for being cooperative or working with the Germans. Again, I'm not going to take a position on that, but I do know it would have been a lot worse if the Germans had been in charge right from the beginning. It also played a major, major role with the saboteurs. It's amazing what they did. I read books about it. There were 2 high school kids that worked in the church group in my hometown. They ended up in jail. And how they could go to school while being saboteurs, I'll never know. So they were preventing food products and other products going into Germany. And those are the major reasons. Plus, 8,000 out of 4.5 million people, Jewish people, is a very small percentage. Probably one of the lowest percentages in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you for that answer. One question about your family. Did your mother come with you to the US?
No, she did not. She got remarried in 1951, stayed in Denmark, came to visit us. As our family grew, we visited her. And during her last years, I visited her every year because I never knew how long she would be able to live. And it was just amazing. When she was 89 years old, the year before she passed away, she finally opened up and spoke to some young journalists about her experiences in the camp. And I'm very lucky to have those CDs and able to use some of the information in my presentation. She died in 1990. No, in 1906, and she was 90 years old, and she was amazed she lived that long. Thank you for asking.
Absolutely. We're at 7:55, so we probably have time for about 2 more questions. I do have another historical question. When the Danish delegation came to the town that had been staged, did they know there was a camp or visit the camp at all?
Oh, yes, they knew there was a camp, absolutely. And they didn't know it had been staged. It's hard to imagine. And again, I'm not totally objective on that, how they cannot see through it, that it was not a regular camp, so to speak.
Sure, because you had mentioned that was propaganda, so that was a good follow-up question to that one.
What I didn't mention was that they took one of the Jewish people who was a well-known film producer, and they had him take films of the proceedings, and they used that as propaganda afterwards. And that film producer, his rewards, a trip to the extermination camp afterwards.
Thank you for sharing on that. Question about the Showa Project. Were you part of the Showa Project to keep your story alive? And maybe can you tell everybody a little bit about that project, if so?
I have been interviewed by Steven Spielberg. I was interviewed about a year ago over a 3.5-hour period. But it's very important that when the survivors are no longer around, there will still be sources so people can still know that a Holocaust took place. Hopefully that answers her question.
Yes, that's excellent. And thank you to the attendee who asked that question and clarified for me. I do have many, many comments coming in, Steen, thanking you for sharing your story. Attendees promising that they will be continuing to share this. I do have a question that if you are comfortable answering this, I'm sure the audience would be curious. You started by mentioning Holocaust deniers. Have you had to interact with or debate or speak to somebody with that point of view?
Unfortunately, I've never come across a Holocaust denier. I wish I could. I would take her or his hand and suggest that we go down and visit the Holocaust Museum in Skokie and see all the evidence. I would, of course, also show that person my book. But a few years ago, and some of the people in the audience may remember that there was a Republican congressman who was a Holocaust denier, and he ran for Congress, and his own party did not support him. And that particular person wanted to be on the radio with a survivor, and I was asked if I would be on the radio with the Holocaust denier, and I absolutely didn't. I was not interested in promoting his denial propaganda. So hopefully that answers the question.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for being willing to share that with us. And then I wanted to share one more anecdote from one of our attendees, because I think it's something you'll want to hear before the evening ends. Eileen shares she's honored to see and hear your story. She lives in South Carolina, but lived next door to your daughter, Christina, who shared your story with her.
Oh, thank you so much.
And Eileen gave her father your book. Her father was a young serviceman in occupied Germany.
Oh, thank you. Wonderful story. And thank
Yeah, absolutely. The connections are wonderful tonight. I
more,
can't thank you enough, Steen. We're at 7:59, and I know that we could probably go on for a long time. Megan has shared information about your book in chat, and we're going to make sure that when we send an email to everybody tonight after the event, that we also share Steen's information so you can purchase the book from him. That would certainly be an additional excellent way to share his story and to make sure it stays alive. Megan, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I just want to thank everybody. Thank you, Steen, for taking the time to talk about your story and, really invite us in with that. Thank you, everybody, for coming tonight, for your very thoughtful questions. As Jennifer mentioned, we will be sending out a follow-up email that will have information about how to get Steen's book. We do also have a copy at the library, which Steen graciously donated to us. So act fast, because we don't have that many, and there's a lot of you in here. But thank you very much for everyone attending. Is there any final thoughts that you want to say, Steen, before we end the night?
I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. It's very, very important. When I talk to students, I often end by, because some of them say, what can we learn from the Holocaust? I think we can learn a number of things, believe it or not. Don't lose hope. My mother was often asked whether she ever lost hope, and she said, no, I couldn't afford to do that with my 9-year-old boy. Respect other people, be kind to other people, eliminate the hate in the world, and treat other people the way you want to be treated yourself. In other words, exactly opposite of the way we were treated by Hitler and the Nazis. And again, thank you very much for being here tonight. And if any of you have questions that were not answered, if you want to send me an email or an email to the library, I'll be happy to answer them. Thank you so much.
Great. Those were amazing parting words. So thank you for summarizing in that way, Steen. We're so grateful for your time and grateful for everybody who was here tonight. Thank you, everybody, and good night.